as most of you know who are our regulars, this series is really focused on creating a space to explore the role of design in shaping the future. So we're really excited to have this topic here today. And we have a group of researchers and designers, experts in the field of autonomous vehicles, and I'm really excited to have them here today. They're going to share with us what they're learning as they work to make autonomous vehicles a valuable part of our future. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists or speakers. We have Ryan Powell, who leads the UX design team at Waymo. Prior to Waymo, he led design teams at Google, Samsung, Xbox, and Motorola. He has a master's degree in design from IIT Institute of Design, and his passion for designing for people and his belief in how technology can improve our daily lives has really been the driving force behind his career. So he's very invested in this space. Wendy Ju, right here, currently teaches at Cornell in the Information Science program. She has a PhD in mechanical engineering and a master's of media arts and sciences from MIT. She focuses on human and robot interactions, and she published a monograph on the design of implicit interactions in 2015. We're really excited to have her here. And Melissa Cefkin is a principal scientist and design anthropologist at Nissan Research. She has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Rice. She previously worked at IBM Research, Sapient Corporation, and the Institute for Research on Learning. Extensive background there. And she explores togetherness and autonomy as they come together in advancing self-driving cars. So we've got some really, really great folks. They're each going to give a short presentation, and then we'll jump into our conversation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan, who's going to come up first.
Thanks for coming out tonight. And I'm excited about this, about the time I get to spend with you, because this is the first time I've actually shared any of the work that we're up to at Waymo with a design audience. And so it's exciting, and it's a little bit nerve-wracking as well. But again, I appreciate everybody coming out. And as Kai mentioned, I lead up the UX design team at Waymo. I've been there for a couple years. And I guess what's notable about the stops on my career is that I have focused mostly on consumer products as a designer. And as Waymo transitions into actually becoming a service this year, we're very much focused on the consumer experience. And so how does the experience work from being picked up in a car to riding in a car to reaching your destination? And so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, so we like to say at Waymo that we're building the world's most experienced driver. I think that's a really good way to think about the technology that exists in the cars today. And so in Phoenix, we've announced that we have, since last year, we actually have people that are using our service on a daily basis. And so they're taking our cars to work, to home, to the mall. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a little bit of what that experience is like when they're inside the car and what they see inside the car. So the reason why that we think when you're a passenger or a rider in the car, we think that it's important to think about the communication that happens today between you and a human driver. So today, when you're riding along with a human driver, there are two types of communication that happens, and it can be direct communication. So you can ask that driver, like, why are you taking this route, or why aren't you going because the light may be green. But it can also be indirect in the sense that you might notice that the driver is repositioning their hands on the steering wheel. So you might get a sense of like, okay, we're about to make a left turn. Or you might see that the driver is watching a set of passengers cross the street. And so that's why we're kind of waiting and we're not moving forward. And so as designers, when we think about being a passenger in a car that doesn't have a human driver, we are thinking a lot about how to recreate that communication, because we think that that's really the crux of building trust between passengers and our technology. So when you get into one of our Pacificas today, this is what you would actually see. So this is the interface that exists in the car today. And again, the purpose or the goal of this interface is to build trust between our technology and our riders. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of the interface design that we've been working on, and talk about some of the different elements, some of the different decisions that we've made as designers as we're kind of thinking about how this interface works. So you may have seen pictures like this before. This is what we call internally, we call this X view, and it's basically an image of what our cars can see based on all of the sensors that it has. And so our engineers use this for development. And I usually like to kind of joke that this was not designed by a designer. This is very much an engineering tool. But as designers at Waymo, what our focus is taking all of the information that the car can see and can sense, and we want to translate into something that is something that's more usable by a passenger or a rider who just wants to go from point A to point B. I think it's obvious, for as we think about ourselves as designers, that this is something that's way too complex. It's way too dense in terms of the information that it's displaying. So when we think about the interface that you see in the car as a passenger, the first thing that we do is we kind of think about this 3D scene that we're looking at. And what we're doing here is we're trying to convey what the car can see around it. And so you can see here we have there's a green path that shows the car's trajectory, where it plans to go. There's a difference between the road surface and the non-road surface here. You can see the crosswalks that we've chosen to draw or render in the UI. There are passengers in this scene, in this frame, and there are also cyclists there. There's a subtle difference when you look at the cyclist, for example. There's a sort of a blue pill or a blue sort of shadow underneath that cyclist versus a slightly brighter or wider one underneath the pedestrians. We've chosen, for example, to render to render pedestrians as using the laser points that we actually have access to. And what's cool about that is that I'll show a couple of videos here in a second, is you can actually see their arms and legs move. Same thing with the cyclists, but when it comes to traffic, for example, the nearby vehicles, we render those more as simple shapes. What we're also doing in this 3D scene is to provide some context about where you're at on your journey when you're in the car. Is we also bring in buildings, for example. So this is data that we bring in to give the user a sense of just context again of where they're at as they're going from point A to point B. One of the things that surprised me the most when I joined the team is our car can understand changing road conditions. And so it might, on a certain day, we might approach a street where there's now a construction zone. And what we've chosen to do in the UI here is we've chosen to render these traffic cones. And what's really interesting is when we get people in the cars and they see this, it's one of those magic moments where they're really surprised that the car can see that there are 12 cones that are actually here. But the reason that we do this is because, a construction zone can be a situation where there's a potential there for a little bit of high stress in terms of the rider, making sure that they understand that the car actually understands that there's a construction zone here. It's not the usual road conditions that are happening. And so that's one way that we kind of acknowledge that. So it's kind of that, going back to that example before between the human driver and the rider, it's an example of like the indirect communication that might happen if you happen to glance up at the screen and notice that, that the reason why we might be taking a little bit longer to kind of like slowly kind of navigate the situation is because we're in this construction zone. The same thing happens with emergency vehicles. So that's another situation where if you hear an emergency vehicle and it's approaching the car that you're in, there's the potential, again, that it could be a high stress moment. And so it's just a subtle example of how we can distinguish. The car knows the difference between an emergency vehicle and a regular vehicle. And so in the interface that we're working on, we've chosen to make that distinction as well. What we also spend a lot of our time doing is trying to figure out the right time and the right place to bring your attention to different elements that are in the UI. And so when we approach an intersection, for example, what we do is we highlight the crosswalks that are active. And what I mean by active is that those crosswalks have pedestrians in them. So they're the ones that matter. And so in this scene right here where the car is trying to make a right turn, it's actually yielding to those pedestrians that are in the crosswalk that's closest to it. So it's a subtle way that we, again, try to draw attention to different elements in the UI so that it's not overwhelming. And I'll show some examples here where the scene is actually moving. Another example is when we are approaching a right turn, what we do is we change the camera angle. Again, based on the information that what we see, but what we're trying to do here is we're trying to mimic what happens as a human driver, where you kind of, you're making that right turn and you turn to your left to see what's coming from the left-hand side. So it's just a bit of a signal there to emphasize that that's what the car is doing. So it's making that right turn, but it's paying attention to the objects that are coming from the left. You can kind of see too, in the example I just showed, there's a bit of a pulse where we reveal some of the laser points every few seconds. And that's just an indication to the user that there's a lot of data that we can see and sense. But the reason why we choose to do it sort of periodically is that it doesn't overwhelm the user with a lot of information on the screen. So if we think of that 3D scene as being really representative of what the car can see around itself, and as a rider or passenger, you might want to glance up and make sure that the car is understanding, that it can see, different pedestrians or a cyclist or nearby traffic. We have what we call this status layer, or this 2D layer that we layer on top of our interface. And the way I like to think about this is it's more of our direct way for us to communicate with you. So when it comes to it could be the fact that we recognize the traffic light here is green, that you're on this street, that we're also in a school zone. This could be a moment where most of the time a user might be, heads down on their phone, but they might get a sense that the vehicle is moving a little bit slower. And they might kind of, ask, why, what's the car doing? Why is it going so slow? And this is the way that we can provide a little bit more information that, hey, we're in a school zone, and that's why we're actually going at this speed. This is another example here where we're approaching an intersection, and again, because the car can, it has these qualities that a human driver doesn't have. So it's able to see, for example, in 360 degrees. And so what it's doing here is it's yielding to the pedestrians that are in this crosswalk. But if you were in the car, you might wonder why the car is not just turning right. And so this is an example with this type of messaging where we're being a little bit more direct about what the car is thinking or what the car is doing. And it's our way to again, to kind of signal, to the user what the car is doing. We do the same thing when you're getting close to your destination. So the car, you could imagine maybe navigating into like a busy shopping center with a parking lot, a lot of traffic, a lot of pedestrians around. And what would happen here is we kind of give some indication of what the car is doing. So it's making its pullover trajectory, but it hasn't quite yet come to a stop. Now, what you're not seeing here too or hearing is that we also incorporate a lot of sound in here. And so actually Connor O'Sullivan is our partner when it comes to sound design. He's a sound designer at Google. And so we're thinking a lot about, the audio experience as well. So yeah, so that's in a nutshell, that's some of the work that the team is doing. And I wanted to get a quick plug in here because I am doing some hiring. You can check out waymo.com, join us, and we have a couple positions that are up there. So thanks.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for that. I loved some of what you're going to say, and I'm going to echo almost some of the same points about communication. So I'm Melissa Cefkin. I lead the user experience group at the renowned Nissan Mitsubishi Alliance Lab, Innovation Lab of Silicon Valley. And we are taking on exploring sort of all aspects of autonomous vehicle development. Also in the lab is work that goes on with connected cars and mobility services. So we have sort of a large scope of work. And my team so far has been focused down some particular paths. I've been there 3 years, and it's a relatively new lab that we've been in a bit of a mode, but where we have many other kinds of problems that we could explore, and hopefully some of that will come up in our question and answer. So I gave a little title to my talk because I kind of wanted to point out, what we're working on, what kind of space, give you a little sense of some of the kinds of projects we've worked on, but also already start the conversation maybe a little bit about what is it as designers and people in this space that I think we need to be thinking about, and how do we do that? And I need some help in thinking about some of the problems, and this is what worries me. So we'll end with a worry. So our UX space is been focused in some particular questions that we're asking. How should autonomous vehicles behave? And this question, if you already start to think about it, is rather different than Ryan's, which is, maybe a little less concerned with what it's the vehicle doing, but starting with once the vehicle is doing what it's doing, how do you keep the customers and the people inside engaged? We look at it from the outside and we say, if people are interacting with this vehicle from the outside as other road users, I think of these as passive users that are constantly encountering vehicles. What kind of experience is that? And what messages are we telling there? And that's where we also use a framework of direct and indirect communications that happen on the road, and I think we'll look at some of that. We also have the question of how should then autonomous vehicles interact? So one thing is the way in which they move about on the road. The other is when they do encounter people, what kind of interaction is that? And then finally, the area that we'll start to do more work on, there are other people in our lab who have been doing it, but we've done a little less from the UX side, is what might they do for people? What kind of services and service design kind of opportunities are there for what they're doing? Hopefully I'm going to get this right. So that translates into our work, translating into we do work that helps the AV development team, the artificial intelligence team, the core technology system develop their algorithms for the vehicle. We also do HMI work, both inside the vehicle, but again, I'm going to talk about what we've done for the external part of the vehicle, and then work on robo-service vehicles and what that would look like. So let me talk a little bit about this question of how autonomous vehicles might behave and interact with people. And we do, so I'm an anthropologist, you heard that. I lead a small team of mostly social scientists. We really have a strong favoring of field studies and empirical work to see what happens today. And it's not because we want to recreate exactly what happens today, but we're going to have to get people from how it is now to how it will be in the future. And so we also want to understand what these, systems are moving into as environments. So let's just take a look at what you might see if you go to Campbell, California, just down the road. Four-way stop, which is kind of a crazy American thing. People moving about, family out on a bicycle trip, cars moving through intersections, following the rules as best we can tell. Whoever arrives first, then the people to the right are going to go. Whoops, we had a little bit of a drama there over who was going to go first, the pedestrian or the car. People carrying on. Another little moment here where people have to stop and figure it out and negotiate it. If we look at this closely, and I'll show the same video now sort of broken down, you'll see it's just filled with these interaction moments. And so the question we're asking is, what happens if you remove a driver and over time, as people become acclimated and they're maybe not paying particular attention to this autonomous vehicle in those kinds of moments? So let's look at it again, now broken down. You see a pedestrian highlighted over there on the right. That pedestrian and this vehicle, the white vehicle, the SUV, have this little conflict over who's going first. And they both go, and they both seem to think the other person's stopping or aren't paying attention to each other. Meanwhile, these two vehicles arrive at just about the same time, and it's arguable who really was there first, so they have to figure it out. And then you have these pedestrians where she quickly stops the gentleman from going, thinking that it's the car's turn. The car driver, meanwhile, waves them on. So there's a very explicit kind of interaction there. So what this tells us is that when people are on the road, they're constantly reading and interpreting what's happening. And it's a beautiful dance of kind of micro-coordination that people are engaged in. It's also moments of sociality. We wave at each other. We smile at each other. We flip each other off. I mean, it's not always beautiful sociality, but we have a very human experience in those moments. So what does the future hold as that begins to shift? The thing is also that it's not always quite like that. So if you start to look around and see how the conventions of movement practices, they can be quite varied. So here, let's look at a different setting. This is large boulevard at a very large roundabout in Tehran. And this is how you move in Tehran or large cities in Iran. Everybody keeps going and you weave in and out of each other. It's a different approach, but it works. Not always, but it does work. It can be a little daunting. This was actually not a very busy day. So there's a lot of weaving, but again, there's a communicative practice that people are engaged in. There's also expectations and conventions about what to expect and how to do this. Now, we are very good as humans. When we arrive somewhere, we can adapt. We can all kind of travel around the world and walk across the street. We can even often rent cars and drive around. But that's because we have all sorts of filters for distinguishing, is something different or not? If it's different, do I want to do the thing that's different, or am I going to, sit back and do how I want to do, but at least I can see what's different? And we can make that judgment immediately. We don't need reams of machine learning data first to go through and then redirect us to tell us what's different. So those are the kinds of things that we look at to ask the question of, and I have one more. This one's really fun too. Especially watch the guy up in the top corner who's coming. This is another Iranian city. Again, people kind of everywhere. The guy's walking down the middle of the roundabout. Here we have a young man who's running to get somewhere, people walking arm in arm through the traffic. What's interesting about it, keep your eye on him because there's an interesting moment coming, is that what's interesting in this case is this particular city, it's called Mashhad, it's in the northeast corner of Iran, and it's actually a pilgrimage site. So chances are a lot of those people actually aren't from there, and they're not locals because they get visitors from around the world who come for this pilgrimage. And so who knows who those people are on the road and what that kind of adaptation is. So what do we do with this kind of information? 2 minutes left. I'm going to very quickly say we work with a system development team, system architecture, you all know these kinds of pictures, to think about the decision-making practices and whether and how they can or should be adapted to become what we call socially acceptable. Are there different social practices and expectations that you can detect in part through speed and velocity and density of everything around you, but there's still differences. A college campus expectations is somewhat different from downtown San Francisco, even if you can see similar densities of people and stuff. So we work with them on motion behavior. And then the other area is we've been exploring whether there is an opportunity to, or a requirement to add new signaling to the outside of the vehicle. We've been focusing on the problem of communicating intent. How do people do that in traffic? And would we want to add something that we would call an intent indicator? So we've been developing concepts and testing those concepts for intent indication. And this is a really, really, really hard thing to test, and we can talk about this maybe more in the Q&A, because there's all sorts of assumptions about practices. If we go test it with people today, nobody knows to look for this thing. We all have expectations of how traffic moves. We're not encountering autonomous vehicles at scale. It's just kind of a one-off. So, what will it mean to understand if this new signal could become a resource that we weave into the fabric of how things work? So those are some of the projects we're working on. I just wanted to say the worry for a moment. As you've been seeing, we're really concerned with these kinds of public environments that vehicles are moving into. And, we have lots of history that suggests that hasn't always been the happiest history of kind of who rules and dominates in these different environments. And so the question is, how do we account for public environments and designing for these kind of socio-technical, multi-agent, multi-object spaces that we don't control all the components, but what we put out in the world is going to have an effect on people's everyday sense of pleasantness, interaction, safety, confidence, and what's happening on the road. So that's where the word comes in, and any ideas people have on how best to get there, we welcome. So thank you.
So who I am, I'm Wendy Ju. I'm an assistant professor at Cornell Tech. I actually until very recently, worked at Stanford and California College of the Arts, so I still think of myself as a Bay Area person. I'm actually a human-robot interaction designer, and I kind of got into cars because of this statement. A car is basically a robot that you sit inside of, and that's increasingly the case. I mean, it's not even just the Waymo cars. There's so much additional automation that a lot of what's going on in the cars is like the car is no longer just a mechanical system that you control with your hands, but in fact, something that you actually have to negotiate and cooperate with in order to just drive down the road. My background in human-robot interaction kind of has given me a lot of skills and techniques that we bring to looking at how we interact with cars, current day cars on the road, but also future autonomous cars. And so I'm going to show you some of those things, some of those techniques, and that's going to be the main thing I'm going to cover in this next so many minutes. I'm going to start out by showing you some of the work that I do in human-robot interaction. One of the things that's a really prevalent technique in human-robot interaction is a technique called Wizard of Oz. And for those of you who don't know, that's something where you actually have a person behind the curtain actually controlling a device or an interface or robot or car. So you can actually pretend to be the automation. You're pretending to be the machine. And by performing the machine, you're able to conduct contingent interaction. This actually started when people were doing natural language understanding and they were making systems. And if you tried to write a conversation, what you thought people would talk about would break down like kind of two relays in. And so it was important to have a person on the other side actually talking to people, but pretending to be the machine so you could develop corpuses of what you actually need to recognize and talk about. So in more physical and mechanical terms, we actually puppeteer robots and then see how people interact with them. So here's a video of some of the work we're doing with a robot garbage can.
Right behind you. Don't come any closer. Oh, look at hi. Don't come any closer. No closer. Okay. We don't have any garbage.
Okay? Are you okay? This is over here. Here you go.
So I actually know Melissa pretty well. And one thing I always love speaking with ethnographers, because the sort of research we do is sort of like ethnography. We like to go to the field. We like to see all the different reactions we have. You really can't anticipate what's going on. But we as designers often do funny things to change the environment and experiment with how people are going to behave in the future. And so that's part of the technique. And that's a technique that now we're bringing to looking at how people interact with automated cars. We actually have this system that we call an on-the-road driving simulator. And that sounds funny, but what we do is we actually have people sit in what feels like an autonomous driving scenario by having them sit in the passenger seat of a car, but we tape on a steering wheel in front of them, and there is like a $9 piece of foam core next to them so they can't see the actual driver. And we just tell people, pretend you're in an autonomous car and you're going to your friend's house, and we actually give them something to do so we can see when they look up and when they're nervous and if they get motion sick and things. Behind the scenes, there's actually a person who's driving the car. That person is driving the car as smoothly and robotically as we can. We actually spent some time actually tailing formerly not Google X cars, just to kind of like pick up what is their style, and we would mimic that style. And in the backseat, we have an interaction wizard, and that person is actually the person who's responsible for running the experiment, like signaling things that are coming up on the road. And we did some experiments to see like whether if you pre-cue the different things that are going on the road, if that helps people with motion sickness or understand intent, if that improves things. But like with most field experiments, the things that end up mattering are not the things that you went in there to test, it's all of these other things that matter to people. So here's some video showing this in action.
How did the dive go?
Oh, it's pretty amazing.
Go, Otto.
Oh. I guess the computer is pretty cautious, which is pretty awesome. There's a number of obstacles that I could have imagined being pretty troublesome for a computer car. It seems to navigate through them all. A flock of people on the side of the road on this really small street, like construction and like traffic and all these different situations where it just basically did the right thing. Yeah, it was a much better driver than most humans.
So how did the ride go in general terms?
I was impressed. It went very well.
Did you feel nervous at any point?
I did. There was a construction site that we went past. There was a construction vehicle, and the guy was waving for me to move. I didn't like wave to the guy or anything. So I was like, I really hope the car does something smart. So the car backed up, and then the guy made more hand signals.
Did you trust the vehicle?
I don't know. I just don't fully trust a car to drive on its own. Even though I had no bad experiences with this car, it just seems strange to me still that a car can drive itself.
We will now turn on the autonomous control, and the car will now greet you. Car, please say hello. Did you notice the car say hello?
I did.
What was it like?
It was an engine roar.
Okay. Did it make you feel uncomfortable or hurt you?
No, I thought it was very friendly.
Was it what you had imagined?
It was what I imagined. It was smooth, cautious, but normal driving experience. Kind of what makes it cool. I think I was surprised how much I trusted it. Even from the beginning when it said hello, that one thing like gave it enough personality for me to trust it. It made me feel like even though it wasn't a human, it wasn't of malicious intent.
It just was driving carefully, slowly. Actually, it reminded me of like a driving school instructor.
Was this pattern of driving okay with you?
Oh, it was ideal. I could definitely own one of these. How do I buy one? What do you think in 10 years?
Okay, so one of the things I'm just going to focus on this last little bit. Like this guy was asked, like, do you trust the vehicle? And he said, yeah. I mean, it said hello, even it didn't have malicious intent. So when people who work on human factors talk about trust and automation, they mean, do you think the car is competent at what it's supposed to do? Do you feel comfortable, like, when you're overseeing, like, knowing that it's doing what it's supposed to do? What they don't mean is it likes me, it's not trying to hurt me, but that is the way that people interpret the word trust, and not just like because they don't understand the questionnaire question, like that's literally the kind of things that they think about. So if you have the car say hello, one, they like it more, but you might also be less likely to intervene because, it's your friend. So there are some really interesting things that come out of this kind of research that I think if you don't actually run field experiments, open-end experiments, you wouldn't find out. We also do some work looking at existing automation. Actually, this is some work that we did with Renault and Nissan. And the setup for this is kind of cool. In the previous study, we actually had two people in the car with the participants. In this setup, we actually are just using like the fact that you can actually do broadband like video and audio like really well over cellular. And so we actually have people who are in an office in Sunnyvale watching video of people driving, watching the road conditions around them, looking at what's happening in the cabin, and then they're using a text-to-speech system to ask people about the experience in the car. And we actually use this to interview people about the experience with existing automation, with the Q50, because even though these cars are on the road, the people who are the controls engineers don't actually totally understand what the user experience of using those things are. So this is existing commercial product. The designers don't have a good handle on that feeling. So it's really useful for them to be able to watch people as they're driving. So here's an example of this. The screen we're seeing is what the wizard is seeing. And then a lot of the things that you're seeing on the bottom are what the telematics from the car are kind of spitting out. And at the very bottom is something that's the text-to-speech interface, so that's the wizard can actually ask questions.
Do you feel that car changes lanes smoothly while engaged?
it felt smooth.
I mean, this is something that, as designers, we can actually use to understand the experience of being on the road better. Like, one of the things is there's all these people are really excited about data science and instrumenting everything right now and getting all the data and having all the video. But still, even in this day and age, the best way to find out how people feel about like something like automation is to ask them. And it's incredibly powerful to be able to ask people how they feel right in the moment, not to ask them to try to remember the drive after the fact. This last piece is also kind of using Wizard of Oz, but in a slightly different way. And we're looking at how people who are pedestrians and autonomous cars are going to interact. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in is what's going to happen in the future when you can't have safety drivers, when you don't have safety drivers behind the wheel. Actually, one of the things we felt is that very often when people are crossing in front of autonomous cars, they're interacting with the safety drivers, even though the safety drivers aren't actually controlling the car. This is actually a little bit problematic. So we were interested in what would happen when, in the future, when you actually don't even have anything to look at. What will people then resort to looking at and negotiating with? So in this study, it's also kind of a field study, one of the things that was interesting is it took a while to get to a place that we could actually ask people about their interactions with the autonomous car, because despite what we all know, we all do, we always make eye contact with the driver and establish their intent, and then we cross. Like, that actually very rarely actually happens. We would actually chase people down after they cross the road and ask about the car, and they'd be like, was there a car? And we're like, the autonomous car? They're like, was there an autonomous car? So what we actually were like, you looked at it, you waved at it, we saw, basically walking down the street is such an automatic behavior that if nothing exceptional is happening, people just like basically perform automatically and they cross the street and they have a way of dealing with it, but they're not even thinking about it. In some of the videos, you might have noticed that once people entered the crosswalk, we eased in a little bit and then we stopped. And that made people look up. And that is the people that we were actually able to interview about the autonomous car, were the people that we actually did that with, because that causes breakdown. There's some expectation of what the behavior is, and when that breaks down, that's when the automatic behavior goes away, and people then are actually actively deciding what to do and negotiating what's going on and seeing if there's a driver. And so that is what's happening in some of these videos, but not what's happening all the time. So I think one of the really cool things about inventing this protocol is that we can't, we are in the Bay Area, we can't find out what people all over the place are doing. We noticed a lot of people would say things like, oh, I thought it was a bad driver, but then it was an autonomous car, it did a good job. And we're like, oh, we're in Silicon Valley, like people are pro-technology. They're like, we're trying stuff. But the really great thing is by inventing this protocol and publishing it, there's actually all sorts of people who've been taking it and trying these experiments in other places, some places where people are less, excited and optimistic to see autonomous cars coming in. So that wraps it up for me. I will say, just as a little ad, I am looking for graduate students. If anyone wants to leave their nice paying job and go to grad school, please come find me. Thanks.
It was really great to get to see the context and the spaces that you guys are working in and the different types of research and design that you're doing. I'm curious, you shared a couple of specific examples of complex interactions, the four-way stop, the driver with the driverless car. What has been really the most challenging one? Can you guys think of one that's been like the most difficult to research or to look at?
From a what the vehicle should do standpoint and where it's interacting with others, I don't know if I'm sure there's many most. Very large roundabouts are super interesting because of the way that you, again, some of the etiquette and expectation about moving all the way in, being in the inside, moving back out, cars coming from multiple angles, and then having to get back out and sort of cutting traffic off. And I'm not going to say that we fully designed for that yet, but that's the kind of thing that we explore. And exit, like if you have roads where there's some going straight and some with exits, and the signaling and what happens on the road are a little bit different. Like these people are going to get a clear signal, but the people turning are going to, again, it's very interpretive what they're going to do. So if that's what you're asking from a roadway standpoint, I think that there's a lot of really interesting dimensions to that. Interestingly, one that we tested, our intention indicator, we also put together a vehicle. Didn't do quite the level of disguise that Wendy's group has done, but sort of treated as if it was an autonomous vehicle, told people there's a safety driver, but and in a very crowded environment, which is a lot of stop and go and pedestrian, actually is not very complicated because that's an easy pattern of stop, go. We're all going slow speeds. It's kind of predictable what people are doing, and it's easy to, again, sort of do that micro negotiation and sort of recognize, oh, that person's parking, I'll just wait, that kind of thing.
For me, the kind of great white whale is actually some of the stuff that Melissa was showing, which is to like really pin down the differences that we know are there in driving styles in different places. Like, when you rent a car and you know how to drive a car, that the car is the same, but the moment you pull out of the airport garage, all the bets are off. And we have a feeling, the headway distance, the aggressiveness of the merge, all these things are different, but like actually trying to instrument things enough that you can actually like say exactly how they're different is really hard. I think that we have this cool system which was originally designed to study platooning, where we actually have multiple people driving in the same virtual world, and we wanted to take the whole thing, go different places and study how people drive differently. And even to set up comparable situations, for example, in the US and Japan is incredibly hard because there are so many contextual things that are different, like the sign heights are at different places, the buildings are different places, everything's spaced differently. And so when you put people in an environment that they're not used to driving in, you actually like can't count on the behavior to be naturalistic. So that's the thing that is the hardest that we're really interested in doing, but we're still trying to figure out how.
One example that comes to mind for us is the pickup and drop-off experience. And so you can imagine with your Lyft driver, when you tell the service where to pick you up and where you want to go, it's very different when you're telling a robot where to pick you up and where you want to go. So there are all these little micro interactions that happen, like at the pickup point. You might signal to the driver that that you're the passenger. You might text or call the driver, and so that's, I think, a big area for us. We've done a lot of work and seen a lot of these situations in Phoenix, and so we're working on some features to really kind of help smooth out that experience. An example would be, if you're giving a lat long point in space for the robot to pick you up at, your natural tendency is to want to, get into the car and not have it continue, onto the final destination. It gets even trickier when you can imagine, a parking lot that's full of pedestrians and other traffic, and how that car navigates that. So we're working on some ideas to make that a better experience. But it's definitely a tricky one.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I think it's really interesting how you talked about all these social norms and how we interact with people and with vehicles, and then with robots. And so I'm very curious in terms of how people, how do you study and understand those norms, and how does that actually shift when when you're interacting with somebody who's not a person, right, with a robot,
And my favorite things is when I hear someone in industry say, like, well, we can't study that. And we're like, well, it's on. Let us figure out how. So a lot of the techniques we use are from stagecraft. Is how we do what we do.
For me, I would draw from sort of the comparative method of ethnography or original anthropology that part of the reason when we go other places and get video, we want comparative cases to work from to think about what's going to happen over time in the future. And the importance and reason to do that now is to identify and clarify things that might be of more fundamental significance in terms of architecture, sensors, capability, that will need to be adaptable in future. So, but that comparative ability to sort of, defamiliarize yourself and look in different kinds of ways, I think is a really important one. And there was something else I was going to say, but it slipped my mind for now. I'll let you go, Ryan, and then.
Yeah, for us, I mean, I think we're fortunate because we have the program up and running in Phoenix, where we have people that are using the service, and so we're getting a lot of our insights from those interactions just on a daily basis for us.
Yeah, I did remember that. One of the reasons I like to include that historical clip of San Francisco from 1906 is that we also have to remember why I think it is challenging to know what the future holds is the whole set of conventions and patterns is likely to change in ways that we can't really know. And so, if you have an unfortunate incident happen in Tempe, Arizona, people's sense of what they're looking for next is maybe beginning to adapt. And again, I think right now we don't have the scale of autonomous vehicles running around to know that what we see today, and very much what you experience, is that people don't give that much regard. It's a very natural thing on the road. But I don't know that we can be certain it's always going to be a very natural thing. Those minute differences of how a robot might move are where we have to pay attention. And once you have a lot of that, people have learned it moves a little bit different, and the whole thing kind of readapts. So even the question of how human-like, and that has been the goal at Nissan too, to develop human-like AI, how human-like really should it be? Or is it more important ultimately for people to truthfully understand they're interacting with a robot that won't be precisely like what humans would be? Hopefully in the good ways it won't be.
Yeah, I mean, that's touching on the sort of communication mechanisms that you're looking at, and understanding, how do we interact with these cars, and what is our expectation? I'm curious, you've tried some of them. What have been successful in that realm?
So for us, for the external, we've been trying, some things we've learned that you wouldn't do. You wouldn't use text because people don't have time to read something. Mm-hmm. Also, it could confuse, if you had stopping, waiting, going, and there's some occlusion where people only get the ing. They don't know which ing it is. So you would have to be careful with text. Icons, of course, we know from design that those can be very powerful in some ways, but not always mutually understood as well. So we've been playing with very abstract and very simple kinds of indicators, like a lighting system. We've learned that it would need to be visible from the fronts and the sides. It would need to operate in discrete states, again, because these are fast-moving, dynamic situations, even the very mundane ones. It's very different than designing for inside the car, where people can give a sustained view on the street. They can't afford to just focus in one direction too long if there's a lot going on. So we're playing with that. But I will also say that, again, without that practice already being present, it's not like we're seeing, it's not like the whole thing stops without it. I mean, Waymo, as we know, does not do these sorts of things. And so it's not like people, it's a runaway success to say we would need additional signaling. So I think the question is it a resource that will enter into the communicative practice or not? But it'll need to be simple, visible, and
easy to parse, yeah.
I mean, in that space, what it looks like to us, but this is colored by what it is we've been able to experiment with, is that people are really attuned to how the car moves, and that they're looking at that from really far away. And so, for example, if you're walking down, you walk to an intersection and you see a car, like you're looking for the car to like slow down a little bit to notice that it sees you. Like the slowing down is the signal that you've been seen. And that's when people feel comfortable crossing. If the car doesn't slow down but kind of coasts to a stop, people will just stand there for a really long time, even if there was time to cross the road, because they're just not sure about what's going on. And even if you like do stuff like you signal something, but the motion doesn't correspond with the thing that's being signaled, then people are just like, well, I feel like I'm going to cross in front of that, And so it's really interesting because like a lot of the things that you pick up from motion happen from a much greater distance than with any of the things you can do for explicit signaling. In our Ghost Driver experiment, it was actually decently difficult to get people to show up at the crosswalk at the same time as the cars because they would speed up and slow down. So they could totally avoid the interaction. And we were kind of surprised how much interaction avoidance people actually engage in, but they do that all the time. And so that's like a really interesting thing that like you have to think about how you can actually design around that, work with it.
Fascinating. And for inside communication mechanisms between the car and the rider?
Yeah, I mean, what we do a lot of experimentation today in trying to understand those moments where you might, again, like you're a passenger and you're sort of heads down maybe in your phone, or you might be kind of enjoying the ride and looking out the window. But there might be those moments where something you might have a question, or you might sort of wonder like, oh, what's the car doing? And we try to, through this research that we're doing, is uncover those moments so that we can be proactive in the communication that we're providing. So then at that point, it becomes, is it something that's a little bit more ambient in terms of its form? Is it there if the user or the rider needs it, or is it a bit more direct, where we might actually want to interrupt what you're doing because we want to tell you something? And so again, that's where we're working with Connor. He's a sound designer, and we're thinking about those types of things. But it's always that balance between how much do we want to interrupt you versus just be there maybe if you do have a question.
That's interesting. And that's also related to this idea of trust, right? Like what helps to build trust in that experience? What are people looking for? Like what are the specific things that help them to gain trust?
Well, I think we try to be transparent in terms of showing what the car can see, because there are, I often describe it as sort of superhuman, qualities that the car, that the technology has. And an example of that would be the car can see 360 degrees around it, unlike a human can when you're driving. The car can also see 3 football fields away. And so those are things that, with sort of that vision of the world, the car is, of course, going to behave in a certain way. And so what we're trying to do through the interface in the car is we're trying to reveal a little bit of that magic to kind of show what the car can actually see. But again, not to a point where we overwhelm the user, but enough to kind of show how intelligent and how sophisticated the system really is. That's what we're doing. I guess the other thing in terms of trust, and again, that kind of, we think that's a means to an end, and the end there is building trust. What I think is also interesting too is a sense of control as a passenger in the car. So you start the ride when you're ready to go. The car doesn't automatically do that. You can pull over. There's a pull over button, and so at any time you can also tap a button and you can speak to a live rider support person. And so again, that sense of control is what we found has really helped ease or build that trust between the technology and being a passenger.
I will say early in my time working on autonomous cars, I got a ride in a Bosch autonomous car. And at some point, the automation failed. It just basically stopped tracking the lane properly because we're on 280 and the sun was in a funny place. But the really interesting thing was, we were basically veering out of the lane. You could hear the bump, 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 bump. And I just felt totally calm. I really trusted the car. I really thought the car would take over. And then the engineers are like, whoop, and the thing that was interesting to me is the way that the car is going to fail and is going to be different than the way that people fail. And what I was really struck by was maybe the feeling that everything is trustworthy and safe is like maybe something dangerous that like I don't want to promote. We want to be really careful because the things that we look at as people to profile the driving of other people might not be the things that you actually need to look out for. And in some ways, promoting a sense of vigilance about the things that actually are the shortcomings of the machine are the things that will be the hardest thing to do. And it's difficult because the machines fail so seldom, and the way that they fail is so unlike how we fail that it's actually really hard to do that well.
Vehicle motion is the most important thing. That's most communicative. So that's where you're going to get a lot of that trust or not. And again, I would argue that some of it is built by this thing is behaving as we kind of expect at this moment. So if a car is too hesitant and pauses too much, then you're like, well, what's it doing? I'm not really sure. And so it's sort of getting that tempo and rhythm right is a big part of it.
The tech world's often accused of starting with the technology and then looking for the problem to solve. I'm curious, there seems like there's a lot of opportunity here to apply this technology in a way that would actually really improve people's lives. What are the different ways that you guys have thought about that you see this could actually solve some big problems?
I think that, with enough development, that the kind of easing that experience of being on the road, relieving some of the anxieties and the pressures, which I think we've normalized a lot. We all just accept that's how things are, and so we wouldn't even think to voice it as a concern. But as you get some of that relief from that micro attention of constantly having to be attention. If, once they get really that good and they're out there, I think that benefit to the mobility experience could be very significant. And also the benefits that you can get sort of ecologically by having smoother driving practices and it's an opportunity to shift fleets in all sorts of ways in which, that kind of promise. But, there's a lot of countervailing pressures that will also intrude in some of those things.
What I'm really in this for is to understand interaction with automation better. And I think the car is just a good starting place. I mean, if you're interested in automation, it's something that everyone understands. The driver is always sitting at a fixed location. It's kind of a dream for doing research. But the larger issue is that the way that we've always dealt with interacting with automation is that we train the humans that are interacting with the automation to accommodate all the shortcomings of the automation. I mean, everyone's always asking me oh, we do this with fighter pilots, we do this with commercial pilots, we must know how to interact with automation. I'm like, you don't know. They just spend all this time every 2 years retraining how to deal with these systems. And so this is really, we're at the vanguard of the moment in time that we're dealing with the problems of automation through design and actually fixing the automation and making the automation behave properly. And I'm excited to be here because I want to do that right.
I mean, what comes to mind for me is some of the changing ownership models around vehicles. So when I was younger, right, at 15 and a half, I would get my driver's permit, right? And at 16, I would, start driving. And I think, and I had a car at 16. I think nowadays that's really kind of shifting and changing. There's a statistic that's out there that basically says that most of the time your car is sitting idle. I have a car right now that's sitting, parked on the street here in San Francisco. It's not in use. And so I think that's one of the things that I get excited about is the self-driving technology. You can think of it as a service, and so it's really an on-demand. When I need to get somewhere, I can use this thing. The other thing that comes to mind too is that people with disabilities and being able to bring mobility or to make their day-to-day lives a lot easier by having a service like we're starting up in Phoenix.
Great. I'm curious. Well, before I hand it over to the audience for questions, I'm curious if you guys have any questions for each other that you might want to pose.
Well, I'm really interested, Ryan, if how prototyping practice happens for the sort of things that you're doing, where the design isn't set and there's a kind of a sense of play. What is the venue in which you guys get to experiment and try things out?
Yeah. So I feel pretty lucky because it's a fairly easy process. We can For stuff that we're doing in the car, we are able, we sit with our engineering team, the design team, the engineering team, the researchers. We're all very close group, and so we can come up with an idea for something or a concept. We can work through and build it out. We can get a car. We can side load that into the car, and the easiest way is really just to kind of test it on a closed course that we have in Mountain View. So we're in a building that used to be a former shopping mall. So there are a couple parking garages that are there, and so those are spaces that are reserved for us. So we can go out on one of those areas, and we can take a look at that. Now, if it's something it doesn't affect sort of this in terms of the spectrum of safety, it's not something that's going to really affect the driving behavior, but it might be more of an experiment with like the interface and the information that we're showing. That's something that we can do a quick build, and we can get out in the car, we can drive around Mountain View, and we can take a look at try to trigger some of these moments that we're trying to maybe capture or communicate on the interface. And so we spend a lot of time doing that as well. Then we have Castle is the name sort of of what we call our closed circuit testing facility. That's a few hours outside of San Francisco, where we're constantly running and testing different sorts of things. But it's pretty. I feel lucky as a designer. We do get a chance to do things on a weekly basis. Just in Mountain View, from our pretty much just outside the door.
So I was also going to ask you, Ryan, on some of the interfaces you showed from the inside. The question for the HMI that you're having to decide, as you said, how much of the information to surface for people. So I'm curious, what are the dimensions of making that decision? So the images we saw, you had other cars, you had pedestrians, and you had bicycles. Were we seeing all the cars, or are you, leaving some out, like the cross-traffic cars that aren't necessarily, the implications of them are different for the vehicle that might be waiting if there's cross-traffic? And then also, whether you have found it important to engage images of different types of vehicles. It looked like there was kind of one type, or do you see them all the same? But more of the thinking behind, as you play with those sort of thresholds, what are the factors that lead you to make those decisions?
Yeah, so we don't do a lot of filtering in terms of what you're actually seeing in that scene. So you pretty much are seeing what the car is sensing. But when I joined the team, for example, we used to render the nearby traffic using the actual laser points. And so the way that they would show up is you'd see sort of cars that looked sort of half rendered in the UI. And it's because, when you look at the way that the LiDAR works, that, you're seeing sort of, half of the vehicles. And so to me, as a new designer coming onto the team, it did feel a little bit weird. Like I was looking at a UI that was kind of, like half rendered and half not. And my concern was that as we, kind of go out to a larger, sort of consumer audience, that UI might look more like an advanced UI, or sort of like something that you might see like in the gaming space. Radiohead, I think, did a video years ago where they just shot it all with LiDAR, and it looks really cool. But for my mom, it might look a little bit strange. And so that's the reason why we've taken, with the traffic, we use these very simple shapes. And for now, we don't differentiate between like a truck versus like a car or a big bus, and other than using size. So we do use size, but we keep those shapes pretty standard across different types of traffic. That's one example. Again, I guess the other example would be, but when it comes to people, the laser points work really well because there's like a little bit of a magic moment where you can see arms and legs that are moving. And to try to represent people as some others, some iconic representation, it just would look kind of weird in that scene. And so that's why we mix in the laser points there, if that makes sense.
Hi, I'm Joanne. I had a question for the panel. Hi, Wendy. Hey, good to see you. I had a question for the panel, since it seems like autonomous driving isn't an all or nothing kind of situation, right? So you have different you have this rate of cars that, it's slow at first on the road, and then you'll have more and more. You have different design approaches, right, to the form factor of the car. Other cars look just like any other cars. So considering the fact that you have this mix of technologies, autonomous technologies on the road, do you think there's going to be some sort of convergence towards one kind of design choice? Like, do you make it look overtly like a self-driving car, or should it just be like any other car on the road? is there a need to standardize these external kind of markings of what makes it autonomous? Like, do you put a badge on the car, a lighting element, or something else? Because maybe the sensors aren't going to be quite as obvious in the future.
So I think the verdict is still out on those, and those are exactly the questions being asked about what degree of conventions to harmonize. I think that we can at least say that there needs to be a certain degree of harmonization about things like the movement patterns, and if there are additional signals added, that those need to be interpretable across all the brands and the makes and models. Speaking from somebody from a car company, we're assuming many makes and models, and that it won't be just one format. And I don't know that you need to have just one format of a vehicle in terms of the actual, cabin style and all that. But the question, again, of the kind of marking and will it identify itself as a robotic car, and if we're fully autonomous, then that might be a little bit easier in the world until we get all the way to fully autonomous. Is it a marking of an autonomous vehicle or an autonomous vehicle that's currently in autonomous mode? Because there might be times it's not. So there's other kinds of questions that are still in exploration, unless you guys know better.
I was going to say that there's this professor at CCS in Detroit, Paul Pangaro, and he says the ethical imperative for designers is always to increase choice. And I think to some degree, in order for things to go, you want some standardization, some harmonization. But what I really fear as a designer is that we kind of prematurely collapse onto a few things before we really have explored the space and understand what's going to work well. And when I do my research, one of the things I'm constantly trying to promote is this understanding that autonomy can come out many different ways. And I think in some ways, because we use the cardboard and tape and string ways of prototyping autonomy, it's easier for us to show all the different ways that you can make things different. But I really want people to be aware of that, because we're still in a moment in time where there's a lot of options for how we pursue autonomy. And people are always trying to tell me why it has to be level 3 or has to be level 4. And I try to explain all these things can be implemented in different ways and have different consequences, but let's actually explore it instead of just trying to make up our mind before we have any information.
Yeah, I completely agree with that too. At Waymo, we definitely believe in that idea of choice, and we see a world where there is room to have a lot of different types of vehicles on the road. So we announced, a few weeks ago around the trucking stuff that we're doing. We announced earlier this week the partnership that we're doing with Jaguar. So you could imagine, hey, you might want to take the family to the mall or to the movies, and that might work well with the minivan that we have. Or maybe you're going on a date and you want something a little bit nicer, and so you kind of go for the luxury option. But so at least in the near term, it's very much a world where I think the more choice, the better.
Hi, my name's Samiha. I'm a product designer at Lyft. My question is, so oftentimes in ride-sharing experiences, the passenger will make decisions or suggest decisions to the driver. For example, don't go on the freeway during rush hour, take the inside road. How did those kind of nuanced decision-making factor into the experience between the passenger within the car and the car? And then my second question is, as you think about level 5 autonomous, and what's needed within society, how do you think about where society is today and how to get to that North Star?
So one of the things that's interesting from human-robot interactions, very often we design things with what we call the H model, which is you design a human-human interaction, you observe a human-human interaction, and then you model the robot interaction. But one of the things that's been coming out more recently is that people don't treat machines with the same social status as other people. So they particularly get very crabby when machines dictate decisions. And so I talk to all sorts of people in the industry who aren't very aware of that, and they're like, the car is a better driver than the person, so the car should always trump, and the car should just go the right route, or the car should just do things. And I don't think they understand that people will revolt when that happens, because it's a machine making a decision for you, and that feeling that you don't actually have autonomous agency, of your body is an incredibly difficult one for people to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that again, along with communication, control is something that we think is really important to allow for a passenger that's in a car, by that's driven by Waymo's technology. So whether it's just the simple things like being able to start the ride, when you're ready as a passenger, being able to pull over, being able to get some help, to get an actual person, on the call with you to ask a question. Those are all degrees of control. So I think it's something that's very important.
I'll just add a little bit on that last question as well. It is a very hard one. I think. But I guess I'm questioning a little bit the sort of North Star, the Holy Grail kind of idea that you have there. I think it's still, even as a researcher, even as a car company person, to continue to ask what are we getting? Why do we think we have to get to that? What is the ultimate benefit and what is the advantage? Because autonomy is not a one-way street, and if you look at what autonomy means, it's a fairly interpretive notion, and it's always relational. It's freedom from something or liberty to do something. It's some agent vis-a-vis something else that's controlling or stopping or oppressing or whatever it's doing. And so that it's relational. So what is it we're getting freedom from? And even there's a lot of people who are quite critical of the levels model because in practices with a lot of autonomy, you go back and forth. I mean, we have, anti-lock brakes, right? There's autonomy with that. But that doesn't mean it's a full autonomy. So sometimes you're going to engage, sometimes you're not. So it was just that little comment on it's actually not a straightforward notion to even understand really what is that level 5. And, is it all the time, forever, always? And when are the ins and outs of it?
I guess it's more of a comment than a question. Sorry, but kind of using computer vision or biometrics to sense when the passenger is high stress or when their heartbeat elevates or something they think something is going wrong. Will the car react to them reacting? Kind of, is that something that you're exploring? Or
I'll say just real quickly that there's a lot of driver monitoring kinds of capability, and I don't know how much Waymo's using, but to get a strong sense of what the driver might be doing, or the person formerly known as driver, the passengers, you could use haptics in seats, on the floor, to get a sense, are people doing braking, or is their body tensing? So there's a lot of work to look at those kinds of things. And then Nissan has come out. There's been some research, and what it showed at CES this year is a brain-to-vehicle technology, which is a cap that is. I didn't do this research. I shouldn't actually be speaking about it because I can tell you about this much about it. But go look it up. It's very interesting. That is sensing. Again, it's getting the very initial or prior sort of brain activity waves, just to sort of adjust about kind of preferences and comfort. It's not to ever control or second guess. But so there's a lot of work, in other words, on those kinds of things.
I have a student who's working on a lot of biometric sensing for his PhD, and I think that's what it's appropriate for right now. It's cutting edge research that barely works, and I want people to understand that. I think if you want to know how people feel, the gold standard is you ask people how they feel, and this is knowing that people lie, this, and they obscure the truth. People do all sorts of things to signal how they feel to one another, and those things that people you actively project to signal, I think are better, more reliable indicators than these things like your heart rate. So just for example, there's also a reason why your heart rate go up. You could be excited or you could be stressed. And what valence that arousal level has, and exactly what is the cause of that. That's something that you can't know just by hooking up some sort of sensor to person. And so you really have to talk to people.
I'm curious, level 4, where it is highly autonomous, not fully autonomous, and people still have to intervene from time to time for edge cases, what are the realistic design considerations and expectations for riders when, in a sudden moment that they need to, may have to make some smart decisions when they may not be expecting to interact?
I think that I don't know anybody who is hoping that a person will jump in with no time to spare, because the person can't react as fast as the car can to any situation. But scene complexity is incredibly hard for machines and super easy for people. And so what you want to do is actually have the car like doing a good job visualizing what the situation is, and for the person to realize that the car can't see the situation well, for example. And that's more like the sort of situation I think in level 4 people are hoping the driver will be trying to intervene, not like, here you go, you're driving, like you just pass over the steering wheel. But just to go back, there's no one way that we've all agreed that level 4 is going to happen. Like all sorts of people are working on all sorts of things. And one of the things that we're sorting out right now, like what are the options? What is the right way to do it? Not like, should we do this?
Melissa, I loved your comment about, or is it the end, that everyone in the world is a passive user of an autonomous vehicle as it's present. And I imagine today, as autonomous vehicles hit the road, they need to signal and behave like a predictable human driver, just to integrate. But then if we fast forward, and autonomous cars are only on the road with other autonomous cars, they would theoretically have their own language, right? And if that's the place we ideally get to, and we're all just passengers all the time, it seems like there's a moment where as soon as a human is present, it needs to behave differently and signal differently. And so there's, I guess, conflict for me in the car making a radical shift from speaking only to robots to speaking to humans as soon as they're present. Does that pose any sort of challenge, or is that a consideration?
The first thing, again, I think the premise of that they'll ever be where there's no humans, then I wonder what the heck we've done. Like, what are they doing on their own without us? Because aren't they for us? And, isn't the point that we get in them or use, put things inside and out of them? And do bicycles go away and motorcycles and all those other kinds of things? But, of course, there's very clever ways that infrastructure can be used to also sort of separate. So if we get to where the vehicles can be just communicating themselves, and the only time that humans are interacting with them are in onboarding and offboarding, then we have that kind of scenario, and maybe the bikes are next door. So then I think it'll be an evolution. So I'm not sure that you would have a sudden jump that then they interact differently together. Right now, as Wendy is making a great point of saying how many different things are going on. Of course, people are already looking at vehicle-to-vehicle kinds of communication and what that offers in vehicle-to-infrastructure kinds of communication. So I think that evolution is happening together with it. So unless I've misunderstood your question, I'm not sure that it necessarily becomes a radical disjuncture. But the little things that would happen, yes, they can drive much closer together. They can go at a consistent speed, maybe a higher speed. The opportunity that even cities and streets can change because you don't need the same amount of space, and all those sorts of things is maybe where it begins to get like, oh, this is now looking and feeling and acting very differently. So those are some thoughts I'm sure you could add as a robot person.
Sure. I mean, one thing I think is exciting as designers is that we deal with path dependencies, that your design is always coming into the context where there's been other things before. And so there are situations where the way that you design things don't have a path dependency, where you're using existing roads where there are already other users. You have to push them off if you wanted to have a future where you're doing what you're talking about. I mean, there's already a lot of automation in construction, in agriculture, and these are situations where there's more like ability to kind of control every single thing in the environment. So I think the thing that's interesting about like on-road automation is the ability to engage with all the other things that are going on. And what I really don't want is a future where we solve the problems by making it easier for the automation by pushing everyone else off the road. But that's just kind of more political, personal take on things.
Thank you so much for the discussion. Maybe I was curious whether in your research you saw any user rebel or sort of abuse the systems, the self-driving cars, and what does that look like, and what can we do about it?
In my short 2 years, I can't say that I have seen anything personally. I've heard of stories, I don't know if it was actually Google's cars, but I've heard of people having different reactions, pedestrians to car, where there might be, some sort of an interaction there. But I don't know, I can't speak to like a specific moment or anything.
Yeah, well, we ran an experiment that was a Woz car experiment, but the car was meant to look like an autonomous vehicle with a safety driver, and we certainly had one person very actively clowning around and trying to, mess with things. And I think there's been reports of that kind of thing happening here with the testing that's going on in San Francisco. The question I have about some of that is how much of that, the potential for gaming, of course, is a very real one that people think, not like the malicious gaming, but just, I can take advantage of the car because it'll stop for me so I can just keep going and not worry. That's a very real consideration. But the more active, like rebelling to do things to disrupt it or interrupt it, the question I think I would have is how much of that is a novelty effect and how much of that will be a persistent kind of thing. But I think as a novel feature, yeah, I'm sure there's probably more cases than get reported, and we've only seen one that I can think of.
All right. Well, thank you guys for all your fantastic questions, and thank you for joining us. That was really fantastic, and hope you'll join us next month. Thank you.